All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is the final week of college football coming up. This is a preview for week 13, all of the different playoff scenarios, how many teams are still alive. We're going to go conference by conference, digest the entire thing, and we begin with the giant elephant in the room, Jordan Travis suffering the injury. How will the committee treat this? Right now, FSU sitting at 11-0, clearly the best team in the ACC. There was already some dialogue about possibly FSU going the full 13-0, even with Jordan Travis healthy and getting bumped out for a one-loss Alabama. Those cries are only going to get louder. One of their best wins for FSU was against LSU non-conference. It's not like they have a crazy remarkable resume. They were down against North Alabama early. They lose their quarterback. I think FSU is in an extremely precarious position, even if they do go 13-0, depending on what happens. If you are FSU, you are 1000% rooting for a clean break, aka Georgia beating Alabama. Bama has 2 losses. They would obviously be behind you, even with the quarterback situation Florida State currently has. Florida State also has had a number of close games. You can see their FPI rank not the best right now at number 9 in the country. They are 11-0. They will face 10-1 Louisville. I do not think there's any way Louisville has a chance of making the playoff, even if they beat Florida State and do finish the season 12-1 with only 1 loss, just because of how bad the ACC is. I think Florida State is their only hope, and even if Florida State goes 13-0, based off of the context of the quarterback injury and the fact that Florida State's played close games, it's going to be dicey. Certainly they can get in, but they might need some things to break their way. This is all going to depend on what mainly happens with Alabama. Also, you could be looking at a Big Ten team, possibly the loser of Ohio State and Michigan. Moving on to the Big 12, it is Texas or bust. That Week 2 win that Texas had, it's propelling them. It's holding them up. They beat Alabama, and then Alabama wins out since then. You know, you can make the argument Alabama was a different team in week 2. Certainly they were, but still, that's a huge win for Texas, sitting at 10-1 right now. They just beat a solid Iowa State team. Now they've got Texas Tech. That should be another relatively easy win. Believe that game's on Black Friday. And then they could possibly be facing Oklahoma State, which is a much better matchup for Texas than Oklahoma, depending on what happens in the final week, because Oklahoma State has the tiebreaker over Oklahoma. If you are Texas and you're going to the Big 12 championship, you want to face Oklahoma State badly. That is that you want to stay away from Kansas State and you want to stay away from Oklahoma. You want to face Oklahoma State, and Texas at this point, you would consider, there are a few different scenarios, but because they have that win over Alabama, they're entrenched over Alabama. As long as they don't lose another game to have 2 losses, that would entrench them, you would think, as the number 4 overall seed. So they're in a spot, unless something crazy happens, to where if they win out, they very likely will get in. There are certain scenarios, possibly with the Pac-12, that could disrupt that, but I would be very surprised, although we will see. We're looking at the Big Ten once again for like the 10th straight year. I'm kidding, but it seems like, the past 5 or 6 years, it's Ohio State, Michigan. Right now, in the FPI, we do get the 1v2 matchup. Unfortunately, when it comes to the actual poll, it's going to be a 2v3 matchup. Ohio State sitting slightly ahead of Michigan, 0.3 points ahead of them. Michigan is at home. They're around a 3.5-point favorite over the Buckeyes. This is it. Could we see a scenario where Ohio State loses to Michigan but still makes the playoffs similar to last year? It's going to be tough, and this could be one of those arguments where, actually, you know what? I think there might be too many teams. I think Ohio State would need Texas to lose, so they would have 2 losses, and they would be behind a 1-loss Ohio State. And then you might get an argument of FSU undefeated, but with a backup quarterback against a 1-loss Ohio State. That's interesting. If you're Ohio State, you're rooting for Penn State to win out. You're rooting for Notre Dame to win out. Those are possibly 2 top 15 teams on your resume. You suffer a close loss to Michigan. Maybe you still have a chance. I think it's going to be very hard for Michigan to make the playoff if they lose to Ohio State because of how bad their non-conference schedule is. That is a heavyweight matchup. I'm guessing winner is in, loser is out. The winner of Ohio State, Michigan will face Iowa in the Big Ten championship, and they will very likely be around 21-point favorites against Iowa in a neutral site. Iowa falling back 4 spots after barely beating Illinois. You can see Maryland and Penn State. Penn State sitting at number 6 right now in terms of FPI. We obviously think they're a little bit worse than that. Next, we are moving on to the Pac-12. So right now, Bo Nix, that pretty heavy Heisman favorite for sure. They are sitting at 10-1. You do have Washington with the big win over Oregon State. It comes down to Oregon, Washington. That very likely Pac-12 championship game will decide who makes the playoffs from the Pac-12. But you do have a scenario with Oregon sitting at number 5 right now in terms of their FPI. They've got a major boost upcoming as long as they can beat Oregon State. That's going to add to their resume because Oregon's resume right now, guys, it's very weak. Now, there are a lot of people that like Oregon because Oregon has been dominating bad teams, but we've seen this a few different times. Michigan being a team that was doing the exact same thing that Oregon was doing. Everyone thinks Michigan's these world beaters. They face some teams with pulses and they struggle, and then people change their tune. Oregon has had a very easy schedule. Yes, you can say they should have beaten Washington on the road. I'll agree with you, but they still lost that game. You can see Washington at this point down to number 13 in terms of the FPI. If you are Oregon, you're set up in a good spot. Obviously, you're rooting for Georgia over Alabama or Auburn over Alabama, but I doubt Auburn will be able to win that game. So you're rooting for Georgia over Alabama. That's a clean break. You would want probably Ohio State over Michigan. You probably at that point have a better resume than Michigan because you would avenge your one loss against Washington by beating them in the Pac-12 championship, and you would also have a win, against Oregon State at that point. That's what you're hoping for if you are Oregon. You do have a solid FPI ranking. You do have, pretty good analytics sitting at number 5 right now, and your resume should improve greatly as long as you beat Oregon State. And then Washington. Washington is in a place where I think they have to win out. The problem is their analytics are so bad at this point. I know people have been saying, what if they go 12-1? Could they lose to Washington State and then beat Oregon and then make it? I mean, maybe. To me, it seems most realistic. They beat Washington State and then lose Oregon and lose to Oregon and then finish at number 5 or number 6. That's what I'll say about Washington at this point. And it would be Oregon, very much the most likely team from the Pac-12, but it is important to note they do not have a good resume right now. That can change, though. And then moving on to the SEC, here it is. Once again, it is Georgia, it is Alabama sitting at number 3 and number 4 in terms of the FPI. Georgia is just a complete wrecking ball right now. They're destroying everyone. They will be facing Alabama. Both of those teams have relatively easy rivalry week games. Georgia facing Georgia Tech, Alabama facing Auburn. It is on the road, but we know Auburn just lost to New Mexico State. So, obviously this becomes a big issue if Alabama beats Georgia, especially if it's a close game. It is a major problem because there will be the argument, how can you leave Georgia out when, I mean, think about this. Think about Texas winning out, Alabama beating Georgia. What do you do? Because you can't have Alabama in front of Texas. So does Texas go to a 2 seed? So the Big Ten winner's a 1 seed. Texas is a 2 seed. Bama's a 3 seed. And then maybe Georgia, maybe Oregon is a 4? Is that what we're looking at right now? Is that and then you also have FSU. Where do you put FSU if they're unbeaten and they have the quarterback question mark? I think FSU might lose to Louisville with a backup. It'll be interesting. We'll have to see. But these are all questions that are all going to have to be ironed out. Right now, I will say, based on how this is set up, I'm concerned about FSU possibly getting left out of this entire thing, even if they go 13-0. I will say that. That's just the vibe I'm getting. But if you want a clean break with the SEC, just have Georgia beat Alabama. Bama has 2 losses. They're out for sure. And that really gives you the 1 SEC team in. Let's say Ohio State beats Michigan. You have the 1 Big Ten team in. And then you're talking about the Pac-12 possibly with Oregon being in if they win their rematch against Washington. Or Washington just going straight 13-0 and they would be in for sure. And then you would be looking at possibly FSU at that point getting in, depending. So right now I'll say the teams, with a legitimate chance, Georgia, they win out, they're in. If they lose to Alabama, it gets really annoying because they're going to have an argument and they're going to base it off of the past 2 years that they've won 2 straight national titles. I guarantee you that's what it's going to be swung as. The idea is, Alabama barely beats Georgia. Georgia has had 1 loss in their past 3 years. They should still get in. we know what's going to happen, and it's going to get really ugly. If Georgia beats Bama, we're in the clear. Just one SEC team making the playoff. When it comes to the Pac-12, there's no way two teams are making it. I see very likely Oregon winning out, getting these two good wins on their resume, making it. If Washington does win out, certainly they're going to make it. They've got an unbelievably great resume. When it comes to the Big Ten, I don't see two Big Ten teams making it. There's just too many it's an interesting argument. It would be a one-loss Ohio State against an undefeated FSU with a backup quarterback. It's an interesting argument because Ohio State possibly could still have a better strength of record than FSU, and FSU would have a backup QB. These are all things that are going to, have to be ironed out with dialogue. And then, of course, you still have Texas lurking there with their road win over Alabama. Things would really open up if Texas lost. They would open up greatly. But as long as Texas keeps winning, it's like the committee has to put them above Alabama, and it becomes very, very interesting. I'm sure a lot of people within college football are rooting for Texas to make the playoff. The other thing I wanted to look at is strength of record. So right now, Washington sitting, even though their FPI is number 13, they have the number 1 strength of record, Ohio State at number 2, Michigan sitting at number 3, FSU at number 4. Strength of record is what determines the college football playoff. Now, strength of record can be very fickle because it can change really quickly. So if Washington loses one of these games, they're very likely going to fall out of the top 5 or 6 altogether. It's nice that they're number 1 for now, but that doesn't give them a margin for error. Normally, strength of record always has the top 4 teams that end up making the playoff. You can see the winner of Ohio State and Michigan basically guaranteed. FSU sitting at number 4, but the strength of record doesn't have the context to the fact that FSU lost their quarterback. Georgia's right there. Certainly, if they win out, they're going to be top 4 in terms of strength of record. Texas is in front of Alabama. That's very important for them. Certainly, they've got the head-to-head win over them. And then Oregon all the way down at number 9 in terms of strength of record. That's interesting that they're that low, but it doesn't surprise me based off of their weak schedule and really lack of key wins. Their biggest game was against Washington. They lost that game. It'll be interesting to see what happens in terms of that. Also, the other thing, Washington does have a very bad non-conference schedule. That might end up dinging them if they go 12-1. And then looking at the group of 5, who is going to be the auto bid, looking at it right now, you do have SMU with a very nice win over Memphis. It's setting up to be SMU versus Tulane. But I will say Tulane faces UTSA, and UTSA is on a tear right now. I think UTSA might beat Tulane outright, but we could get SMU going. We will see. It could be interesting. Imagine UTSA beats Tulane, makes their conference championship, and then faces SMU, and then beats SMU. Would that knock the American out altogether? Because UTSA already has 3 non-conference losses. That's an interesting scenario. And then you do still have Liberty sitting there at 11-0. Could Liberty, if they go 13-0, really make, be a New Year's 6 team? I just think they have such a bad schedule. We will see. Looking at the Mountain West, I really don't think anyone from the Mountain West, maybe Fresno State, it just seems like everyone in that conference at this point has cannibalized themselves. But either way, we have a very interesting setup when it comes to the college football playoff. If I want to simplify it right now, the winner, can I even say, there's no way they leave Alabama out. If Alabama wins out, dude, how do they get left out? Because they would obviously have to be in front of Georgia. They would be, what happens with Florida State at that point, The Florida State thing is really throwing a monkey wrench into the entire thing, but I would say at this point, Washington wins out, obviously they're in. Ohio State wins out, obviously they're in. Michigan wins out, obviously they're in. Florida State wins out, I don't know. Georgia wins out, obviously they're in. Texas wins out, 99.9% chance they're in. I don't even know the scenario where they wouldn't be in at this point, depending, because they're always going to be in front of Alabama as long as they keep winning. Alabama wins out, they would leapfrog Georgia. They would probably be in as a 4 seed. And then Oregon wins out. Oregon is the one that's interesting because they keep blowing everyone out, but their schedule has not been good. But I would say if Oregon wins out, they're probably in, unless something crazy happens. It'll be interesting because you'll get the arguments of Oregon as a 1-loss team against Ohio State as a 1-loss team, but Oregon would be a conference champion. I'm guessing they would go with Oregon in a scenario like that. But it's just interesting. And then you also have Florida State there. You're going to start seeing some of these 1-loss teams try and argue themselves against possibly an undefeated Florida State. Imagine Florida State loses to Louisville, Texas loses to Oklahoma State in the Big 12 championship, that opens up everything. Alabama loses to Georgia, that eliminates 3 teams right there. And then you're possibly looking at, maybe a one-loss Big Ten team getting in as the 4th spot, but you would need FSU to lose, you would need Alabama to lose, that would give them 2 losses, and you would need Florida State to lose and finish 12-1. So guys, we will see what ends up happening, but that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.